Okay, another very important part of the Cold War is the second proxy war, the Vietnam War. The first proxy war was the Korean War. And a proxy war, remember, is when a country is supporting the enemy of their enemy. Okay, they're helping the enemy of their enemy. For example, in North Korea, they supported the North Koreans in the Korean War, and during Vietnam, they're going to support the North Vietnamese. And so we're gonna watch. This is a good video. It's 9 minutes. It's the longest video you'll see, but it's a good video. It's the causes of the Vietnam War, what actually led to the situation in their country, which brought the United States in, and why did we escalate force and stuff like that. It's a pretty good video. Okay, so 9 minutes. Sit back and enjoy.
War was a devastating experience for the United States. More than 58,000 Americans were killed in the conflict, and the long, bitter war deeply divided the American people. Why did the country enter this costly war in the first place? Although the United States did not enter the war on a large scale until 1965, the build-up to war began many years earlier. In fact, American involvement in Vietnam dates back to World War II, when the United States sought to end the Japanese occupation of Southeast Asia, including Vietnam. To do so, the U.S. government gave aid to a band of Vietnamese guerrilla fighters known as the Viet Minh. The group was led by Ho Chi Minh, a communist who greatly admired the United States. With American aid, the Viet Minh won control of large areas in northern Vietnam. When Japan surrendered to end World War II, it pulled its troops out of Vietnam. Ho and his followers saw the departure of the Japanese as an opportunity to drive out the French, who had ruled Vietnam for about 100 years as a colonial power. After the Japanese left the country, Ho declared Vietnam's independence. His declaration came in the midst of changing world politics, changes that would have profound effects on Vietnam. With the end of World War II, U.S. President Harry Truman worried about the growing power of the Soviet Union. The Soviets were installing communist governments in Eastern Europe, creating a strong communist bloc. Truman believed that communism threatened democracy and human rights, and saw it as the responsibility of the United States to prevent its spread. Truman viewed France, a democracy, as an ally in the struggle against communism. France, in turn, wanted to regain control of its colonies in Southeast Asia. That is why, when Ho Chi Minh asked the United States to help Vietnam, Truman never responded to his letters.
Okay, so when Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Cong, or the Viet Minh, were fighting against the Japanese during World War II, we funded them, we helped them militarily in order to defeat the Japanese. But now they've become communist and they're asking for help against the French. The French are our allies, not only in the UN, because the French were part of the 5 quote-unquote winners of World War II. I say quote-unquote because the 5 winners are France, America, it's faces. France, America, China, England, and the Soviet Union. Now, France and China are there just because they were invaded by Japan and they were liberated. And so it's kind of like you're at a party, someone gets jumped, they get beat up pretty bad, and you beat up that guy for them, and then so later on he's all beat up and you just let him hang out at the party with you and just follow you around. He's real grateful. Okay, and that's what France and China are. But anyway, so because the French are our allies in the UN and in World War II overall, they do not support Ho Chi Minh this time against the French for their independence.
Ho turned to fellow communists for support instead. Then, in 1949, Communist Mao Zedong took control of China. The change renewed American attention on Asia and increased American worries about communism in Vietnam. Back in Vietnam, France was busy fighting the Viet Minh to regain control of its former colony. Both China and the Soviet Union were supporting Ho's forces. To prevent Vietnam from falling into communist hands, the United States pledged economic and military support to the French. In 1953, Dwight D. Eisenhower became president. He and his advisors worried that if Vietnam turned communist, the rest of Southeast Asia would follow in turn. This idea, called the domino theory, would shape American actions in Vietnam for years to come. Then, in 1954, the French lost the vital battle of Dien Bien Phu. Weary of war, they prepared to withdraw from Vietnam. By international agreement, Vietnam was divided in half at the 17th parallel. Ho was allowed to control the northern half. Anti-communist forces held the southern half. The agreement also called for elections to be held so that Vietnam would be united under one leader. Ho was expected to win. But the United States had no desire for Vietnam to be unified under a communist leader. The elections never took place. The United States started providing economic and military aid to the South Vietnamese government, led by Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem was unpopular, however, and many in South Vietnam opposed his rule. Communists in the South formed a group known as the National Liberation Front. They sought to overthrow Diem and unite North and South Vietnam. NLF guerrilla fighters called the Viet Cong destroyed roads and bridges in the South and assassinated government officials. They carried out these attacks with the help of North Vietnam.
Okay, this is the Viet Cong they're talking about. The Viet Cong are an unconventional fighting force. They're not going to wear normal uniforms. They're going to use unconventional tactics, which we're going to cover in another video. Viet Cong, one of the communist groups fighting the United States in Vietnam.
After John F. Kennedy was elected president in 1960, U.S. involvement in Vietnam took a new turn. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev had promised to back all wars of national liberation, like the one in Vietnam. This confirmed American fears that communists were bent on taking control of the world. Kennedy and his top aides saw South Vietnam as the only hope they had in preventing the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. Kennedy sent 400 military advisors to Vietnam to teach the South Vietnamese army how to fight the Viet Cong more effectively. North Vietnam grew concerned about increasing American involvement in the war. Meanwhile, support was dwindling for Diem and his government in South Vietnam. Diem showed favoritism to fellow Catholics, which angered the mostly Buddhist population of South Vietnam. Diem also cracked down on anyone opposed to his rule, whether communist or not. His government began arresting and even killing opponents. Buddhists began to burn themselves alive in protest of the Diem regime. American leaders came to think that they could never help South Vietnam win a war against communism under the leadership of Diem. To alleviate this problem, the United States backed a military coup to replace him. In November 1963, Diem was removed from power and assassinated. 3 weeks later, President Kennedy was assassinated. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was inaugurated as the new president. Johnson was a firm believer in the domino theory and did not want to be the president who let Southeast Asia fall to the communists.
The domino theory is when they believed that if Vietnam fell and became full-blown communist, North and South, that also Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, all these other countries in that area would also fall as well. That is, we're going to lose this war, and the only country to become communist after Vietnam, the Vietnam War, is Cambodia.
Johnson also thought that pulling out of Vietnam would destroy American credibility, since 2 prior presidents had pledged their devotion to a free South Vietnam. In January 1964, another coup took place, and General Nguyen Khanh became the new leader of South.
A coup is when the military takes over the government. And so this guy was a general. He led his troops. They followed him. They overtook the government.
Vietnam. The United States began to support Khanh in hopes of obtaining a stable government in South Vietnam. Khanh was unable to build a strong base of support, however. The lack of a strong leader would make it very difficult for South Vietnam to defeat the communists. Then, in August 1964, the fighting took a new turn. An American destroyer, the USS Maddox, was patrolling the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of North Vietnam when North Vietnamese torpedo boats began to fire at it. 2 days later, the Maddox reported it was under attack again. The attacks infuriated President Johnson. He ordered airstrikes against North Vietnam in retaliation, He also asked Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which granted the president permission to do anything necessary to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. The resolution allowed Johnson to send troops to fight in Vietnam without having to ask Congress for a declaration of war. Johnson began developing a strategy for complete American involvement in the war. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong were making more attacks on American positions. In February 1965, the Viet Cong initiated an attack on Pleiku, an airbase north of Saigon, killing 8 Americans and wounding many more. The political situation was...
Okay, so that was actually the first time that they had attacked us, legitimately attacked us.
...worsening in South Vietnam too. Con had been replaced, and a series of coups followed. Johnson's advisors urged him to mount a bombing campaign against North Vietnam, to punish the North for its support of the Viet Cong, and to rebuild morale in South Vietnam. Johnson agreed and ordered Operation Rolling Thunder, a continuous bombing campaign against North Vietnam. He hoped the intensive bombing would bring the North to peace talks. It did not work. While the bombing got underway, American military commanders warned that South Vietnam's army was on the verge of collapsing. Johnson sent more American troops into Vietnam. American soldiers also stepped out of their advisor roles to take on more active military operations. 3 weeks after a force of U.S. Marines was sent to protect the Air Force base in Da Nang, the Viet Cong attacked the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. As attacks continued in the South, Johnson was forced to send more and more American troops. By the end of 1965, more than 180,000 troops were committed to Vietnam. The United States was now fully involved in the Vietnam War.
Okay, and so that is a great video on the causes of why we got into the Vietnam War. It's just one of the many examples you'll see in American history, excuse me, where we're going to fund someone because they're fighting against our enemies. In this case, we funded Ho Chi Minh during World War II because he was fighting against the Japanese, and later on he's become our enemy and we go to war against them. And the Vietnam War cost the United States 58,000 or more than 58,000 American soldiers' lives. And so it's one of the first examples that we've discussed on these videos. So just understand that. Here we go. So that was a great video on the causes of the Vietnam War.